US president says a whole civilization could die that night, you are no longer watching routine brinkmanship. You are watching the public language of a war move from pressure to possible societal punishment, with a live deadline hanging over millions of civilians. That is where this story begins. Not at the truce, but at the moment the destruction of ordinary life started sounding operational. And the reason that sentence hit like a shockwave is because the infrastructure logic was already underway. At least 2 steel plants, 3 bridges, and 1 pharmaceutical plant had already been hit, which means the systems that carry medicine, movement, and economic survival were already inside the war. By the time the word civilization was used, the war had already started touching the skeleton of civilian life. Then came the turn that should tell you exactly how close this got. Roughly 90 minutes before the deadline, after hours of rhetoric that sounded like the preface to national-scale devastation, a 2-week ceasefire suddenly appeared. That is not a relaxed diplomatic transition. That is what it looks like when the next step has become too dangerous to test. If you're here for the layer beneath the headline, subscribe right now. And before we go deeper, tell me in the comments what you think really happened here. Did one side win, or did everybody lunge for the last exit before the region crossed a line it could not uncross? In Tehran, Zaha Argavan and Mehdi Alishir packed a war backpack because they believed electricity and water could disappear and they might have to run. That is the human meaning of this title. The whole civilization was not some floating phrase above geopolitics. It reached homes, backup supplies, bottled water, and the private calculation of whether the next night would still be livable. That is why the click on this title was never about hearing another lecture on diplomacy. The audience clicked because they wanted the real measurement. How close did this get to something bigger, darker, and harder to reverse than the official language was admitting? And the answer starts with a brutal distinction. There's a difference between war damage and civilizational pressure. War damage hits targets. Civilizational pressure starts touching the systems that let a society move light itself, medicate itself, and stay coherent under stress. That is the layer most coverage tries to soften. It wants to describe this as a swing from extreme rhetoric to emergency diplomacy. But that safe version actually hides the most important truth. The threat did not sound terrifying only because of the words. It sounded terrifying because those words landed on top of a real campaign already pressing into infrastructure. So if you are asking whether the title promises real, here is the first answer. Yes. And this got close enough that ordinary civilians were already preparing for the loss of basic systems before the ceasefire was even announced. That alone tells you the distance between threat and breakdown had become dangerously short. Then came the move that exposed how real the countdown felt to everyone around it. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif publicly asked for a 2-week extension to the threat, aimed at Iran's whole civilization, tying it directly to the Strait of Hormuz. Mediators do not beg for time like that when they think the next few hours are just theater. That detail matters because it destroys the comforting version of the story. If outside actors were urgently trying to stretch the clock, then they were not treating the threat as a dramatic flourish. They were treating it as a live decision point with consequences large enough to demand immediate intervention. And once you see that, the truce stops looking like a graceful diplomatic achievement. It starts looking like a brake pedal. Something reached a level where the people in the room no longer liked what the next move might do. The obvious explanation would be morality, but morality alone does not explain a last-minute reversal like this. The harder explanation is leverage, not just military leverage, but strategic leverage, sitting in a place so sensitive that it can punish the entire system. Iran had already established a virtual chokehold over the Strait of Hormuz and was disrupting global energy markets before the truce arrived. That means Tehran, even after taking damage, still held the one lever capable of spreading pain afar, beyond the immediate battlefield. So the ceasefire did not emerge after one side had been emptied of options. It emerged while one side still had a choke point in its hands. That is the part many viewers instinctively feel but do not always hear said clearly. A state can be hit hard and still remain strategically dangerous. It does not need to dominate the battlefield to change the kind. Calculations of stronger powers, if it retains control over the one artery, everyone is afraid to lose. This is where the story widens beyond war footage and turns into something colder. Fuel prices, shipping risk, insurance, fear, allied pressure, domestic political cost, all of that starts entering the same room as military planning. Suddenly the question is no longer just what can be destroyed, it is what cannot be destroyed without detonating consequences much larger than the target. That is why the Strait of Hormuz mattered more than any public slogan. It had become Iran's single most important strategic leverage point, which means the war was no longer operating only on the logic of punishment. It was operating on the logic of mutual vulnerability. And once wars hit that layer, every next step becomes more dangerous than the language around it. Now the title sharpens even more. That's how close this got does not only mean close to another strike package, it means close to a moment when infrastructure pressure inside Iran and energy pressure outside Iran could have fused into one uncontrolled escalation ladder. That is the hidden violence inside the phrase truce. Truces in clean victories sound orderly. This one sounded abrupt because the underlying problem was not solved. It was frozen. That is a very different kind of calm, and this is exactly where official narratives start lying by selection. They do not always fabricate facts. Often they just spotlight the one piece that protects their pride and hide the 5 pieces that show how incomplete the situation really was. The information war started the second the ceasefire was announced. Washington and Tehran both sold the same temporary truce as a victory, which is usually the clearest sign that neither side got a clean strategic finish. When opposite capitals are marketing the same pause as proof they won, the real story is almost always hiding in what neither can admit. Washington needed this to sound like coercive pressure had worked, because the alternative was politically toxic. The alternative was admitting that after all the threats and all the force, the outcome on the table was still a short pause full of unresolved terms. Tehran needed this to sound like resistance had worked, because the alternative was no better. The alternative was admitting that the regime had taken serious punishment and still needed breathing room while its enemy could claim it had forced movements. So both sides took the same event and turned it into domestic camouflage. One called it proof of successful leverage, the other called it proof of successful defiance. And if you listen only at that level, you miss the actual pattern staring straight at you. The actual pattern is that neither side was talking like a power that had achieved final strategic clarity. They were talking like powers trying to stabilize perception, while the structure underneath the war remained unstable. And here is where the pause gets even more fragile. Iran did not describe full normalization in the Strait. It said passage would be possible for 2 weeks through coordination with its armed forces and with technical limitations, which means Tehran was not surrendering its gatekeeper role. It was preserving leverage inside the very terms of the pause. That difference is not cosmetic. It is the whole trap. One side wanted to frame this as reopening. The other side framed it as managed passage under Iranian supervision. Those are not the same reality, and temporary deals built on different realities tend to break under pressure. So if you are waiting for the moment where this stops looking like a clean climb down, this is it. A state that still gets to define the mechanics of safe passage through a global choke point has not been reduced to passivity. It has simply agreed to pause in a way that leaves its relevance intact. That should instantly kill any lazy idea that the crisis ended because one side clearly imposed its will. No. The pause happened while the core leverage remained contested, the wording remained elastic, and the future arguments were already being planted in the language of the agreement. The clearest way to describe this deal is also the least comforting. It was a pause, not a lasting resolution. That matters because pauses fail in 2 ways. They fail when somebody shoots, but they also fail when both sides discover they were never actually describing the same arrangement in the first place. And this pause carried both dangers from the start. The military risk was obvious. The interpretation risk was buried inside the language. That makes it the kind of arrangement that can look calm on the surface while staying structurally wired for renewed confrontation. This is also where audience intent gets fully paid off. People did not click on this title to hear the tensions rose and diplomacy continued. They clicked because they sensed the headline was concealing a near miss. The near miss was not just more bombing. It was a collision of military escalation, societal vulnerability, and global energy leverage. That is why the phrase "from threats to a truce" can be misleading if you hear it too softly. It sounds like movement from danger into safety. But what really happened was movement from one form of danger into another. Form of danger from open escalation into compressed instability. Then came the fracture that made the whole thing even more unstable. Israel backed the 2-week suspension on Iran, but Benjamin Netanyahu's office said Lebanon was not included, which means the geography of the war was already splitting. The moment the pause was announced, even before the truce could settle in the public mind, one major front was already being carved back out of it. That is not a side issue. That is the architecture of how temporary calm dies. If one theater pauses and another remains hot, then escalation has not been defeated. It has been redistributed. And redistribution can be more deceptive than direct expansion. It lets leaders talk in the language of de-escalation while force continues moving somewhere else. That gap between narrative calm and operational continuation is where audiences get misled and where fragile deals quietly unravel. So now the title answers itself more clearly. That's how close this got, means close enough that even a supposed truce was born with a fracture line already visible. Close enough that the region could not even pretend to shut every dangerous door at once. Close enough that diplomacy had to arrive in the same atmosphere as exclusion, ambiguity, and unresolved force. That is not what real stabilization looks like. That is what strategic recoil looks like. And this is the threshold the crisis had already approached, whether the final strike package launched or not. The threat itself openly invoked catastrophic consequences for over 90 million people, which means the war had already entered a phase where the destruction of civilian critical life was no longer outside the bargaining language. Once a conflict gets there, the moral and strategic line has already moved. That point matters because it survives both versions of the story. If the threat was fully real, then the truce came after the war had moved terrifyingly close to a campaign aimed at the systems that keep society functioning. If the threat was partly bluff, that is still a dark conclusion, because it means civilizational punishment and infrastructure collapse have already become usable tools of coercive messaging. Either way, the same truth stands. This was not just almost a bigger military exchange. It was almost a deeper transformation in what the war was willing to threaten. Bridges, power, water pressure, medicine flow, movement, daily life, social coherence, the things people only notice when they begin to disappear. That is why the most powerful image in this entire story is not a podium or a post. It is the idea of people inside Tehran trying to calculate whether tomorrow would still function. That is the real measurement of proximity. Not how loud the rhetoric got, but how near it came to turning the infrastructure of civilian life into a legitimate instrument of pressure. And that is also why the truce cannot be read as reassurance. It must be read as warning. A warning that all sides had already looked far enough down the next step to decide that they needed time more than they needed. Immediate escalation. Think about what that means. Time became more valuable than momentum. Time became more valuable than proving toughness. Time became more valuable than carrying the threat all the way through. States do not suddenly prize time like that unless the alternative has started looking dangerously irreversible. So, no, this was not one of those stories where the scary part was only the headline. The scary part was the structure underneath it. The verified infrastructure pressure was already real. Civilizational language had already entered the public frame. Hormuz was already biting the wider system. A mediator was already trying to stretch the clock. And the truce still arrived, carrying ambiguity and exclusions inside. That is the full payoff of the title. From whole civilization threats to a truce, this got close enough that the next phase was no longer about hitting another target. It was about whether the war would step into the architecture of ordinary life and drag the wider region and global system with it. So if you came here asking whether the audience's instinct was right, whether this was bigger, uglier, and closer than the official tone suggested, the answer is yes. Much closer. Close enough that the pause itself became proof of proximity, not proof of safety. And the final truth is the hardest one. The region did not step back because trust suddenly appeared. It stepped back because distrust had become too expensive to express through the next strike. That is not peace. That is a cliff edge, seen just clearly enough to make everyone freeze. That is how close this got. Stay with this channel, because we follow the moment before the world admits what it almost did.